Throughout the 1920s, the French company Citroën experimented heavily with military vehicles that used Kégresse suspension. This suspension was initially created by engineer Adolphe Kégresse, who was French but had worked in Imperial Russia prior to and during World War I. Kégresse returned to France in 1919 and was hired by Citroën to produce vehicles using his suspension. The Kégresse suspension consisted of a soft rubber track that had a unitary belt-type structure instead of several metallic interlocked parts. It was often used in a half-tracked configuration, including for artillery tractors, but also armored cars, such as the Schneider P16, which was developed during the 1920s. The Citroën P28 was originally designed as a one-man turretless tractor, intended to carry mortars and ammunition under the Type N program of the French infantry, formulated in October 1930. It used an original half-track configuration, with two steering wheels at the front and a suspension using Kégresse tracks at the rear. While the two other vehicles offered for the Type N specifications were both fully tracked tankettes, clearly inspired by the Carden Loyd. While 3 P28 tractor prototypes were produced and tested in the summer of 1931, they did not provide satisfactory results and were not accepted by the French infantry. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article covering this little-known French armored half-track. If you like our content and would like to see more, please do consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. The funds go towards the illustrations that are on every article and every video we make. The rejection of the P28 as an infantry tractor did not stop development of the vehicle though. While a program initiated and conducted by the infantry, the Type N vehicles quickly attracted interest from the French cavalry, as they were very light and quite mobile. The cavalry developed the concept of automitrailleuse légère de contact, light contact armored car. In essence, this was a very light and only minimally armored and armed vehicle that was tasked with reconnaissance missions. While the frame in which this was accomplished is uncertain, two variants of the P28 were modified with armament by Citroën in late 1931. It is known that no new vehicles were produced. However, whether a single vehicle was transformed twice or two prototypes were modified is unknown. These modifications, done very hastily and more for demonstration purposes than to serve as a durable definitive vehicle. These saw the replacement of the rear storage area of the infantry tractor with a fully rotatable turret, adding an additional crew member. Two different turrets were experimented with. One was cylindrical in shape and seemingly featured a 37mm SA-18 main gun, similar to the gun-armed Renault FT tanks and a number of other French armored vehicles of the era. This turret was manufactured by the firm Schneider. The other prototype featured a much more rectangular shaped turret, armed with a single machine gun of unknown model. The prototypes also had some differences in their hull design, with the driver's hatch being extended further back than on the original tractor prototypes. Being conversions of original P28 tractors, those prototypes kept some of their elements, notably an engine to the front right of the vehicle in front of the turret. This prototype also retained the same engine, the Citroën C4 4-cylinder 72x100 1628 cm3 engine with an output of 30 horsepower. On 15th October 1931, a date which may have predated even the first P28 prototype being transformed, the French cavalry placed an order for 50 armored cars, though those featured a vastly modified design. They were delivered in 1932 and 1933. The P28 design, which entered cavalry service in 1932, appears to have skipped the prototype stage entirely. The two first production vehicles were tested in July of 1932. One was given the C6 6-cylinder 2,442 cm3 engine with an output of 55 horsepower, and the other the K6 6-cylinder 3,020 cm3 engine with an output of 67 horsepower. This later engine was finally chosen as the definitive one for the production P28, though issues in its development would lead to some technical issues in the first months of P28's service life. The vehicle finally entered regular service within the French cavalry in April of 1933. In comparison to the prototypes, it featured a turret mounted not on the rear of the vehicle, but instead in its center. This turret had a simple design and theoretically featured the new 7.5mm Mach 31 machine gun as its main armament. However, this appears to have been rarely mounted in practice, with the vehicle mostly being used for driver training. The turret had 3 hatches that could be opened for vision, one on the rear and one on each side. A vision slot was also present on the front right of the turret. It had a 2-part top hatch from which the commander entered the armored car. The vehicle had a quite significantly revised hull design as a consequence of the addition of this new turret. The previously horizontal mudguards were now angled backwards, somewhat similarly to the tracks, though at a lower angle. The whole central armored superstructure had been redesigned to accommodate the turret, with a new 2-part front hatch being designed to enable the driver to access the vehicle. The commander, who also fulfilled the role of gunner, entered through the turret hatch. 3 smaller vision hatches were featured just under the turret, one frontally, one on the front left, and one on the front right. A frontal drum, similar in concept to those found on Schneider P16 armored cars, was fitted at the front of the vehicle, in order to improve crossing capacities. The P28 also had 2 notable, large front headlights. Those were sometimes placed very far forward, very close to the drum, or further back just in front of the turret. The vehicle's Kégresse suspension had a large front sprocket and a single bogie holding 2 road wheels as well as a large rear trailing wheel. The 2 front wheels were used for steering. In comparison to the P28 prototypes, the production model featured a more powerful engine that had been pushed from the right side to the back. It was a Citroën K 6 cylinders, 3020 cm3 petrol engine producing 67 horsepower. The vehicle could, with its modest weight of 4,540 kilograms, reach a maximum speed of 53 km per hour on a good road. It retained very modest dimensions, with a length of 4 meters, a width of 1.63 meters, a height of 1.96 meters, and a ground clearance of 23 centimeters. The transmission featured 4 forward and 1 reverse speed. The vehicle's armor had been raised to a maximum of 9mm. However, quite shockingly for a production run of an armored vehicle, it was not manufactured using military quality steel, but instead mild steel. With a thickness of 9mm, this meant the P28 had basically no protection at all, being vulnerable to even rifle-caliber bullets. Indeed, it appears the cavalry's P28 order was meant to be, from the start, for training purposes only, while specifications for a more advanced reconnaissance armored car were being worked on, the AMR specifications being published in January of 1932. The production P28 armored cars were delivered to the French cavalry units from 1932 onward. As they served a training role, it appears they were not delivered in large batches, but instead to a variety of units in small numbers. The 1st Bataillon de Dragons Portés, motorized dragoon battalion, is known to have made use of some towards 1934, for example. The vehicles appear to have been designated as automitrailleuses de reconnaissance, reconnaissance armored cars, despite their training function, with the actual role of operational AMRs being taken by the tracked AMR 33 and AMR 35. Despite being generally considered a mediocre vehicle, the P28 was the subject of one foreign order. In either 1933 or 1934, the Guardia Metropolitana Uruguayana, a military unit of the police of Montevideo, received 3 P28s, which appear to have been part of the batch of 50 ordered by the French cavalry and not built specifically for this order. Why or how the Guardia Metropolitana picked the P28 is unknown. It has been theorized the vehicles may actually have been intended to be delivered to Paraguay to reinforce its troops fighting in the Chaco War against Bolivia, but may have ended up in the hands of the Uruguayan force instead of reaching their intended destination. In any case, the P28 vehicles were put to use by the Guardia Metropolitana, and appear to have been the first armored vehicles used by the South American nation. It appears they were painted in a very light grey color. Little is known about their service life, and few photos of the vehicle in Uruguayan service remain. In the French army, the P28 remained confined to its training role. Despite the breakout of hostilities with Germany in September of 1939, they were typically kept as far from the front line as possible. While it is sometimes claimed the vehicles had been retired by 1940, photographic evidence tends to show this was not actually the case. While not frontline vehicles in any way, the P-28s were kept as training armored cars for the French cavalry. A surprisingly high number of good quality photographs of these vehicles remain, which tends to be a rarity with pre-World War II French armored vehicles. Considering their less than strategically important use, it is likely the P-28 armored cars were far more easily accessible to photographs and journalists than more useful vehicles. While not meant to see combat at all, it appears that, following the disastrous German encirclement of a large part of the French army, along with the British Expeditionary Force and the Belgian army in northern France, the P-28 armored cars were pulled out of their training role to be used in a last-ditch effort to defend France. Desperate times need desperate measures, and these wholly inadequate vehicles, just like a variety of other armored vehicles pressed into service, such as the D-1 tanks urgently shipped back from North Africa, or B-1 bis heavy tanks sent into combat without their turrets. Little to no detail is known of the P-28's action in the closing days of the 1940 campaign, but considering the vehicle's abysmal combat capacities, it is unlikely to have performed well. Some photos do show German servicemen posing around P-28s, including some which appear to have taken some damage. It is known that some were captured intact, however, unlike the vast majority of French armored vehicles, they were not pressed into German service or even given capture denominations, being entirely disregarded by the Wehrmacht. The surviving French vehicles were most likely scrapped during the war. While all French vehicles appear to have met an undignified end during the Second World War, this was not the case for the Uruguayan vehicles, which were untouched by the war. Between 1958 and 1963, the last surviving Uruguayan P28, now vastly unnecessary as the country had acquired far more potent vehicles, such as 40 M3A1 Stuarts, was put on static display at the Plaza de Armas del Instituto Militaro, a military school in Montevideo. At this point, it lost its light grey camouflage for a more military-looking green one. At an unknown date, the vehicle was then moved to serve once again as a static display in the quarters of the 4th Cavalry Regiment. The vehicle is now located at the Plaza de Armas de la Guardia de Granaderos in Montevideo. It was at some point painted entirely in an orange color with the exception of the suspension painted in light blue, but now appears to bear a more modest dark grey paint job with GM for Guardia Metropolitana painted in yellow on the turret's front. The Citroën P28 is one of the most often ignored armored vehicles fielded by the French military in 1940. It was an obscure half-track armored car that only offered mediocre performances and was theoretically limited to a training and perhaps propaganda role at first. However, the vehicle did end up seeing very limited combat because of the general collapse of the French military, though most vehicles appear to have fallen into German hands unharmed. They were ignored by their new owners, who appear to have promptly sent them to be scrapped. Nonetheless, the vehicle has some interesting elements. It serves as the first armored vehicle of Uruguay, which would then go on to become a regular customer of American light tanks, acquiring M3A1s and then M24 Chaffees. The P28 is also one of the last combat vehicles using the Kégresse track system, an innovation originating from a French engineer in Imperial Russia, and which was experimented on heavily by the French in the 1920s, but somewhat fell aside, at least for armored vehicles, in the following decades, mostly because of the typical fragility of Kégresse tracks. That's all for this video. Make sure to like, subscribe and hit that bell button. We'll be releasing new videos on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram or Reddit. If you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. And if you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.